Shalom. Today I'm going to talk about some of the very important things that we need to think about it on this coming Rosh Hashanah. As we're going to enter into the new year, I thought, what would make us very successful in the coming year? We have experienced many move of God in the last year, but we want to see greater move of God in the coming year, greater move of His glory, greater way He restores things in our life. Now, one of the places where we can experience great move of God is Shabbat. And God has given Shabbat as a gift into our life. Now, when we look into this aspect, Shabbat, on the coming year, and think deeply about it every week, we will see something profound happening in our life. Now, one of the important things about Shabbat is it's a gift that God created for man in the very beginning of the creation. Now, when we see in Genesis 2, 1 to 3, where God, after He created the heavens and earth, He rested on the seventh day. On the seventh day, He rested and He named it as Shabbat. And it became a day where He sanctified it and He set it apart. So Shabbat was instituted by the Lord in the very beginning of the creation. So in the coming year, we need to think one important thing in our life is to keep our Shabbat in the right way. If you're going to keep our Shabbat in the right way, we will see a greater move of God that the Israelites experienced thousands of generations before in the Old Testament. Now, as we know, Shabbat was not instituted by man, but it was instituted by God. It's a core thing that every man is called to experience Shabbat in his life. But the problem today is in the Christian world, especially, Shabbat is as considered as something where you have to go to the church and involve in the church. Okay, it's perfectly fine. But when we look deeper into Shabbat, it's a lot bigger than the Christian world talks about rest, or in the Jewish world talks about Shabbat. Now, Shabbat was something that was intertwined in the very aspect of creation. 6 days God created everything, and on the seventh day, He Himself rested. Not only He rested, but He also rested with man. That is the beauty in Shabbat. So when we see in the very second chapter in Genesis, the first story of the creation ends with something very profound. That is, God rested and He sanctified it and made man to rest with Him. Now, the question will come, is not the other days are not sanctified. Of course, other days are sanctified, but He specially sanctified this day. That He sanctified in a way that man will have 100% interaction with God. He will not have any diversion. He will not think about the work. He will not think about some things that he need to do next day. He will not focus on anything. So He created in a way, and He sanctified it in a way that the relationship with man and God will be in such a sanctity. Now, anything that goes outside the sanctity, it's not in the eyes of God. Now, when we sanctify a marriage, what we say, a marriage between a husband and wife, it is sanctified. Now, what do you see in that sanctity? That husband has to be part of the wife and wife has to be part of the husband. Now, if husband crosses that line and goes somewhere, he broken the sanctity. He broken that holiness in that marriage. So what God is bringing is, God being the father and the bridegroom of our life, He brings us as the bride into that relationship so that we will act in sanctified manner. We will not prostitute ourselves on that day into the things that is not involved in our life. So that we will completely focus on God and completely set our life into that alignment and guard that sanctity. So God said He not only sanctified the day, but He also made it in a way that man will honor that sanctity. so that he will walk with God and come in alignment with that whole day in such a beautiful manner. Now, the next interesting thing that you will see in Shabbat is where you will see something very interesting. And you see the whole story of creation, something very interesting you will find. Now, one of the interesting story in creation is on the sixth day, God created man. Now, after creating man, what God did, he took man to enter into rest. That is the beauty of it. Now, if you see, according to the first chapter of Genesis in creation, that God created man and woman, he took both of them into rest. Now, we cannot say, okay, God only took man, not the woman. That woman can do what she wants. No, God took both of them. He created both man and woman in his image, and he brought them together in a way they will enter into rest with God. So the very fundamental aspect of Shabbat is for both man and woman. Now, the interesting thing in this is man didn't go to work immediately he was created. After his creation was over, as per the understanding of the first chapter of Genesis, he went straight into rest with God. That is the beauty in it. So man, after creation, he entered into rest. And from the place of rest, he entered into work life. Because God rested with man. So after creating man, God was so excited. He wanted to have a personal relationship with man. He wanted to interact with the man whom he has created in his image. He wanted to interact with a woman whom he has created in his image. He created both of them in his image, not one, both of them. So he wanted to enjoy that intimacy. So he brought them into the place of rest after creation so that he can celebrate with them. The whole purpose of creation. They were talking, laughing, everything. Probably they might be telling how God would have told all the stories of his way he created things, and he would have had great communion with man and women on that seventh day. We cannot imagine how Adam and Eve enjoyed their first Shabbat on that day. It was so profound. They were excited to run. They were running around with God, and they were laughing and enjoying. So the very first Shabbat started with God and family. It was with man and woman. It was with Adam and Eve. So it didn't start somewhere in a synagogue or in a church. It started with family. The very first foundation of creation of Shabbat started with family. God said, okay, now I have created man and woman. Come on, let's go have fun. It's Shabbat. I've made it holy. That is, I have sanctified it in a way that you and me alone going to enjoy together, that nobody can cross this sanctified line. There's going to be a great level of holiness. There is going to be a boundary in it. That you and man should enjoy, you and women should enjoy that celebration with me. That is what the call God gave for Adam and Eve. Their first Shabbat with God was excellent. It was holy. It was such a great move. And after Shabbat, he said, go into the garden, enjoy, do what I've told you to do many things, keep doing, then come back. So the very creation was established in a way to celebrate Shabbat. And the purpose of Shabbat has changed the very dynamics of the creation. Now, what happens next in that story? Now, when we see the whole aspect of the story in Shabbat, in the first part of the creation, there is something that we need to know a little more deeper. Now, the seventh alphabet in the Hebrew consonants is Zayin. Now, it's gematria 7, which means this alphabet, which means crown, weapon, sustain. Zayin in one form, which means Zun, which is to sustain and nourish. So the very first Shabbat was with man and God to nourish one another, sustain. So man has to be nourished by God, not by the created ones, but by the Creator. Now, the interesting thing is the very first Shabbat created a definition that man can be nourished by only one person, that is God, so that he can be actively involved in the creation what God has created. He cannot nourish himself from the created ones, but he can nourish himself only from the Creator. That is the beauty of it. So if I need to be nourished, I have to go and settle my time with God in rest and to be nourished. My wife cannot nourish me. My children cannot nourish me. My wife needed a nourishment. She needs to go to God. So the very foundation that God has given us in one form is that we need to be nourished. But how that nourishment will come? That can come only from God and God alone. And that only will change the whole dynamics. That only will change the very essence of our journey. That is the beauty of it. So the very purpose of Shabbat clearly says to sustain and nourish. And who is going to sustain and nourish us? It's the Creator. It's not the created ones. What a difference. So it's the Creator who is going to sustain and nourish me. So I don't need to push my wife and expect her to nourish everything for me. My wife doesn't need to push me hard to nourish everything for her. So our primary sustenance or nourishment comes from God and God alone on the day of Shabbat. So that is what the institution that God established for Adam and Eve on the day that Adam could get nourished from God and Eve could get nourished from God as a family. Now, the next important thing that you will see in Shabbat is it starts from evening to morning. Now, the very first aspect of the story, when we see in the first chapter of Genesis, we will see always it is evening to morning. God calculated the whole day as evening and morning. Now, why God has to calculate it as evening and morning? Now, when we look carefully into the whole story, we will find something very interesting. Now, evening, let's take this word evening in Hebrew, erev. Now, I'm going to expand these three alphabets in the word erev. Ayin, Resh, and Bet. Now, Ayin means eye, Resh means head, and Bet means house or family. Now, when we take the first alphabet, Ayin, in one word, one way, the alphabet means watch or know or shade. Resh means first, top, and the beginning. Bet means house or family. Now, when we take the word Erev in one full form, we can say, when we come to God that evening on Shabbat, watch what He has done. And what He is going to do that whole day of Shabbat with you. Carefully be listening to His voice. Carefully be willing to hear His voice. Watch around. He may be speaking in different ways, in different forms, maybe in the visual manner, or in hearing manner, or even in terms of smell, or through a voice. In any form, God can speak on that evening. As the evening begins, God is going to speak the whole day of Shabbat in a beautiful manner. Watch it so that you will guard your life in holiness, so that you will watch everything God is going to speak and take it, because it's going to be a great time of conversation. Now, as the beginning of Shabbat, it's in the evening, it is the beginning of everything. So my conversation with God will begin everything in the following week in my life. I don't begin everything in my life. It's God who begins and initiates everything in my life. That evening when I come before God and celebrate my Shabbat, I tell the following week, He's going to begin everything, because I begin with God that evening. Because that evening, as I start my Shabbat, I begin with God. I begin with His communication. I begin with every excitement that I have come into his heavenly house. I'm interacting with him. Now, where the next thing comes, the very existence of Shabbat begins at home. It doesn't begin in a church. It doesn't begin in a community. It starts at home. The very beginning of community, it starts at home. So when we are entering into that evening on Shabbat, watch over what he's going to talk about. Because he is going to begin everything for me that Shabbat day that will lead for next 6 days, how he is going to work through my life. Because he is going to initiate everything. So I need to keep an eye over it. So that whole Shabbat gives me an eye over him. My eyes should be fixed on him. And then he is going to initiate many things on that Shabbat and initiate many conversations with me that is going to flow like a river for next 6 days in my journey. And the very existence of Shabbat starts with family. Me and my wife, and if I'm single, me and my parents. If I'm alone, me alone. So the very existence of Shabbat, as we enter into Shabbat evening, our life gets transformed. So as the new year begins, as we enter into the 8th year, I want you to think deeply how you're going to have your Shabbat in your life. How you're going to celebrate the day of God-given holiness in our life. And another interesting thing when you see in Shabbat is very important. The most important thing that you will see here is in Exodus, God says something. In Exodus 20:10 and in Deuteronomy 5:12, we will see something, what God is asking man to do. But in Exodus 28, in the beginning, we will see God says, remember it. In Deuteronomy 5:12, God says, keep it. So he says, do not forget. Do not forget. Your beginning is all about Shabbat. Your week begins with Shabbat. Your week doesn't end with Shabbat. Your week begins with Shabbat. So do not forget about it. And keep it and guard it. That God says, guard that holiness, guard that sanctity that God has established in the very beginning of the creation. So when I'm going to bring that aspect into my life, I'll be able to see a great move of God, a radical move of God in every aspect. That is where the whole Shabbat lives. So when God instituted the commandments for the house of Israel, he made it 2 simple aspects. One is do not forget, remember it. And another one is, he said is, keep it. Keep it means guard it. So the more I learn to guard it and more I learn to remember it, I will experience the greatness of God. And that is where life begins. Now, the next aspect of Shabbat comes very important. Do you want to be very creative? Now, creativity comes from God. But who was part of that creativity with God? It's the spirit of wisdom. When the spirit of wisdom was with God, it was running with God. In Proverbs, we say this, the spirit of wisdom says, then I was the craftsman beside him. I was his daily delight, always rejoicing with him, rejoicing in his own world and delighting in mankind. He says, the spirit of wisdom says, from eternity I was appointed from the beginning, before the world began. When there was no depths, I was brought forth. When there was no fountains abounding with water. Adonai brought me forth the first of his way before his works of old. Before God could create everything, he brought the spirit of wisdom. Do I need to have a spirit of wisdom? to be highly activated in my life? The secret is Shabbat. When I'm able to align with what God has set for me, the spirit of wisdom who was with the Creator will align with me in my journey. With the spirit of wisdom aligning with me in my journey as the way he aligned with the Father in the creation, he will align with me for next 6 days after Shabbat to bring God's creativity and his creative purpose in everything that I touch, everything that I work into. Today, the most creative people that you could see in this world are the ones who honored God in Shabbat. If you go into science, if you go into arts, if you go deep into their life, you will see that they are the ones who honored God so deep and a profound manner. So the very fundamental aspect of creativity does not comes from how much you know about creativity. It all comes with a very secret weapon, that is keeping Shabbat. When I keep my Shabbat in fullness, I'm also aligning with the spirit of wisdom who was with God before the creation. He will come and jump and dance along with me so that I will experience the power of creativity. He will rejoice with me because he's the craftsman who comes along with me in bringing the craftsmanship of God in my life. It's not because I'm smart, I am creative. It's because if I'm honoring Shabbat, then I can experience the powerful move of the spirit of wisdom, followed by understanding, leading me to a path where I can experience a great move of God, a great vital move of God in every space of the society. Take any field, I can experience the creative move of God if the spirit of wisdom is residing in me. To let the spirit of wisdom reside in my life, I need to honor God in Shabbat. That is the core thing. So honoring God on Shabbat brings a greater blessing. That blessing is the power of the Lord's creativity. That the spirit of wisdom comes and dances with us and brings us to a place of greater creativity. Today, what the world is looking for us is the creative move of God in our life. It's not how smart we are, how creative we are. Now, the next thing that we could see in Shabbat is, now what do you eat in Shabbat meal? The bread and wine. What the bread says, the fullness. What the wine says, the sweetness. Now, when we see in Genesis 14, where we will see Melchizedek will receive the bread and wine from our forefather Abraham. Now, in the Christian world, it is understood that this is the communion that we receive, that Melchizedek instituted. But the beauty in that is, both are significantly similar. The bread brings the fullness, and the wine brings the sweetness. If I need to experience the fullness of God, I need to honor God on my Shabbat. If I need to experience the sweetness of God, I need to honor Shabbat. The fullness of my life and the sweetness of my life cannot be attained from my spouse or from my children. The fullness and the sweetness of life can come only from God and Hashem alone. So that fullness that I'm receiving, the sweetness that I'm receiving, I'm willing to share to someone. The sweetness that is overflowing in my life should go into the lives of people. The fullness that I have, that I break it and give it to people around, that it multiplies. It's the same way when I'm seeing communion, what Yeshua has instituted is the same. When we take bread and break it, it brings the fullness of life. When it is broken, it multiplies. It brings a great fullness and overflow in my life. I remember what Yeshua has finished it on the cross, so that I can experience the fullness of life. when I drink the cup of wine, when I remember what he has shed on the cross, so that I can experience the sweetness of life. It's not only the forgiveness that I receive from him, but also even more greater, a greater fullness and sweetness, a bringing life into a place that I can share with others, so that our life will be actively engaged with the broken world, so that we can build the lives of people. Now, another interesting thing is that about Shabbat, as I said, what Yeshua did it on the cross, he reset the Shabbat in the way it was before in the Garden of Eden. He brought us back to the very place where man lost his Shabbat, lost his true Shabbat. Even though the commandment was given to the house of Israel, many times they broke it. Many times they were not faithful. They struggled. But today we don't need to struggle and break it, because what Yeshua has finished it on the cross, he brought us into a place of greater freedom, so that we will come back to Genesis 1 and start the life from the place of rest back to life. But the fall of man at large, when we see here, has brought him to the place of toil. But today we don't need to toil, as I said. When we are abiding with the spirit of wisdom, we don't need to toil. The flow of God is natural, because the spirit of wisdom is going to guide us and lead us in every aspect. So as I close, I want to leave you with great question. Will you be willing to honor Shabbat in this coming year? In the year 5783, can you hold your mind and tell God, Lord, I'm going to honor Shabbat. Please guide me through. In the last 6 years in my married life, what kept me going is not my marriage. It's the Shabbat that kept me going. In the last 6 years, what I had seen, the fruit of the Shabbat was my married life. The life that I experienced with my children. The life I experienced with my work area. Everything, every overflow that I experienced, it was not because I was perfect. It's the Shabbat that brought my life into that perfection, brought the flow in my life. So what I want to leave you today is, when you think of this year, one decision that you can make in your life to bring your life to a complete level of success is keeping Shabbat. If I'm able to honor God on the day of rest and start my life from the day of rest every week in the year 5783, definitely I will see the move of God and the greater glory of God and the greater level in which he will do the restoration in my life. May Hashem bless you abundantly. Shalom.